There is a fence row outside Brantford, Ontario, in Brant County, where a cockshut 40 sits under a lean-to roof that someone built for it 40 winters ago and never got around to tearing down. The paint has gone the color of a dried rosehip now, but underneath the rust bloom, it is still recognizable. That particular red the old-timers called vermilion, a shade that sat somewhere between International Harvester's Red and Massey's, closer to blood than to brick. Farmers in this county used to say a man's politics, his church, and the color of his tractor told you everything you needed to know about him. The company that mixed that red into paint stopped doing so in the 1960s. The tractor is still there. The company is not.
This is the story of how that happened, and why on farms from Brant County to the Peace River country of Alberta, the disappearance of a red tractor meant something that a balance sheet could never capture. Vermilion red was Cockshut's signature, the way Persian orange belonged to Alice Chalmers, or Farmall red belonged to International Harvester. Paired with a cream white trim the old parts catalogs called clover white, it was a color combination you could spot from the road at 60 miles an hour, and Canadian farmers did exactly that. A red farm was a Cockshut farm, full stop, the same way an orange farm was Alice country in Iowa. When the tractors rolled off the line at Brantford in the 1950s, that red was doing more than looking sharp in a showroom. It was announcing loyalty, region, and often a family's history going back 3 generations of plow buyers. Keep that color in mind. It disappears twice in this story, and the second time, it disappears for good.
The company did not begin with tractors. It began with plows, and it began with one family. James G. Cockshut founded the Brantford Plough Works in Brantford, Ontario in 1877, a modest operation building horse-drawn implements for the farms of southwestern Ontario. When James died not long after, leadership passed to his brother William Foster Cockshut, and then in 1888 to another brother, Frank Cockshut. In 1882, the company had been formally incorporated as the Cockshut Plough Company, and by 1910, the youngest of the brothers, Henry Cockshut, had taken the helm. Under Henry's direction, the company secured the financing to expand aggressively, and by the 1920s, Cockshut had become the dominant name in Canadian tillage equipment. Plows, discs, cultivators, the unglamorous steel that actually turned the soil.
Cockshut did not yet build its own tractors. In 1929, the company arranged to distribute the Alice Chalmers Model 2035 and the United tractor line to its dealer network, a stopgap that let Cockshut sell iron under its own name while someone else did the engineering. In 1935, the company shifted that arrangement to Oliver, rebadging Oliver tractors for the Canadian market. It was a sensible, patient strategy for a company that understood plows and implements but had not yet built an engine of its own. Then came the war, and with it, a transformation nobody could have planned for. During the Second World War, Cockshut's Brantford plant became a wartime manufacturing hub, building undercarriages for Avro Lancaster bombers, plywood components for the Avro Anson trainer and the de Havilland Mosquito, and artillery trailers and shells for the war effort. The workforce at Brantford swelled to nearly 6,000 people, a great many of them women doing precision manufacturing work that no one had imagined for them a decade earlier. It was, in its way, the making of Cockshut as an industrial company, rather than simply an implement dealer with a famous name. Out of that wartime manufacturing experience came the moment that actually put Cockshut on the map as a tractor builder in its own right. In 1946, the company released the Cockshut 30, its first fully independent tractor design, built around a 4-cylinder Buda engine. The Cockshut 30 carried a feature nobody else in the industry had yet delivered to farmers, a truly independent power takeoff, allowing an implement to keep running off the engine even when the tractor itself was stopped or the clutch was disengaged. Before this, a farmer running a baler or a mower had to keep the tractor moving to keep the implement turning, and if the machine plugged, he had to declutch, idle down, clear it by hand, and start the whole sequence over. The live PTO on the Cockshut 30 changed that entirely, and other manufacturers spent the next decade catching up. The same basic machine was sold in the United States under private labels, including the Co-op E3 badge and Gamble's FarmCrest 30, a common practice of the era that let a modest Canadian manufacturer punch above its weight south of the border.
The Cockshutt 30 was the beginning of a genuine tractor family. The company added the Cockshutt 40 in 1949, a heavier 3 to 4 plow machine, the smaller Cockshutt 20 in 1952, and in 1953, the Cockshutt 50, a 4 to 5 plow tractor that would be sold in the American market as the Co-op E5. In 1956, to promote its acquisition of the Ohio Cultivator Company, Cockshutt introduced the Blackhawk 35, finished in a cream and orange scheme that stood apart from the rest of the line. Fewer than 2,000 were built, and today, a surviving Blackhawk is treated by collectors the way a rare pressing is treated by a record collector. The high watermark, though, the line that represented Cockshutt at its most confident, arrived in 1958, when the company unveiled an entirely new family in one stroke, the 540, 550, 560, and 570. The sheet metal was styled by Raymond Loewy, the same industrial designer responsible for shaping the look of Studebakers and Coca-Cola bottles. And for Cockshutt, he abandoned the streamlined curves he'd once given Farmall tractors in favor of a squared-off, purposeful boxiness. Nobody needed a tractor to look aerodynamic. The top speed of the thing was 15 miles an hour. What Loewy gave Cockshutt instead was a modern, confident face for the brand. A waffle-pattern grille, the vermilion red and clover white paired in a scheme people called harvest gold and red belly on some models, and a family resemblance across the line, from the 30-horsepower 540 up to the 65-horsepower 570. A larger flagship, the 580, was drawn up to sit above even the 570, a 100-horsepower machine. Only 3 were ever hand-built. 1 survives today. The rest were destroyed on the order that shut the line down. That order came in early 1962. It came fast, and it came for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the quality of the tractors themselves. Cockshutt's independence had already been compromised once, in 1958, when English Transcontinental, a British mercantile bank acting on behalf of an American investment group, took over company ownership. It was the kind of transaction farmers rarely noticed at the time, and rarely forgave once they understood it in hindsight. Control of a company that had built its reputation over 80 years, passing into hands with no attachment to Brantford, to Ontario, or to the particular red paint that farmers had trusted since before the war. The final blow came in 1962, when the White Motor Corporation, an Ohio truck manufacturer that had already purchased the Oliver Farm Equipment Company in 1960, bought Cockshutt Farm Equipment outright. White would go on to acquire Minneapolis Moline the following year, in 1963, assembling under one roof 3 storied, independent farm equipment brands that had spent decades competing against each other on the strength of their engineering and their color. For White, it was consolidation. For a Cockshutt dealer in Saskatchewan or a farmer in Brant County who had bought Cockshutt implements because his father had, it was the end of something that could not be bought back. For a few years, White tried to have it both ways. Rather than kill the Cockshutt name outright and risk losing the loyal Canadian customer base overnight, White had the Oliver plant in Charles City, Iowa, build tractors that were mechanically identical to Oliver models, but wore Cockshutt badges and Cockshutt paint. From 1964 to 1969, the Cockshutt-branded 1550 through 2150 series were, underneath the sheet metal, Olivers. The same engines, the same chassis, covering the same 55 to 110 horsepower range that the old 560, 570, and 580 had once occupied, differing from their Oliver siblings in color and logo alone. White filled out the smaller end of the lineup by selling a rebadged Minneapolis Moline Jetstar 3 as the Cockshutt 1350, and later a Fiat-built diesel as the Cockshutt 1265. It kept dealers supplied and kept the red paint on the road a while longer. But everyone in the trade understood what was happening. A proud, independent Canadian manufacturer had become a paint scheme and a decal on someone else's tractor. In 1969, White formally merged Oliver, Minneapolis Moline, and Cockshutt into a single organization called White Farm Equipment, headquartered not in Brantford or Charles City, but in Oak Brook, Illinois, with the parent, White Motor Corporation, running the whole enterprise from Cleveland, Ohio. There is a moment in this merger, quieter than the 1962 sale,
but in some ways more final, that the surviving company records mark plainly. The last Cockshutt-badged combine, a turbocharged 131 horsepower Model 2150, left the assembly line still carrying the Cockshutt name in 1968, one of the final machines to do so before the brand identity began its last slide into silver. By 1975, White discontinued the Oliver, Minneapolis Moline, and Cockshutt names entirely. The green of Oliver, the yellow of Minneapolis Moline, and the vermilion red of Cockshutt were all replaced by a single uniform color, the silver of White's new Field Boss line. 3 regional loyalties, 3 families of farmers who had spent generations telling each other apart by the paint on their machine sheds, were folded into one corporate palette chosen in a boardroom in Illinois. The red disappeared from the landscape for the second and final time.
White Motor Corporation itself did not last much longer than the brand it had absorbed. Financial trouble through the late 1970s forced White to sell its agricultural division to a Texas firm, TIC, in 1979, and the agricultural recession of the early 1980s pushed the equipment further down the chain of corporate ownership, to Allied Products, then partial absorption into Massey Ferguson's combine business, and eventually into AGCO, the conglomerate that today owns what remains of the White name as a legacy brand under Massey Ferguson. The Brantford plant that once employed thousands of Cockshutt workers, the same plant that had built bomber undercarriages during the war, no longer builds farm equipment at all. Brant County's population has grown in the decades since, driven by proximity to the greater Toronto area rather than by agriculture, and the industrial identity that Cockshutt gave the town for the better part of a century has been folded into a more generic, diversified local economy. The name survives mostly on street signs, in local museum collections, and on the tractors themselves.
Somewhere tonight, in a machine shed outside Regina or in a heated garage in eastern Ontario, someone is running a rag over the vermilion red fender of a Cockshutt 30 or a Cockshutt 570 that has not built a plow furrow in commercial anger in decades. Cockshutt collecting is a serious, organized pursuit in Canada, with clubs, tractor shows, and swap meets dedicated specifically to keeping this one Canadian-built brand alive in memory and in running order. The Ontario Tractor Show circuit, in particular, treats a well-preserved Cockshutt with the kind of reverence other regions reserve for a Farmall or a John Deere Model A. These are people, often the sons and daughters of the original owners, who learned to time a magneto or set valve clearances on a Cockshutt from a parent who bought the tractor new off a Brantford dealer's lot. The knowledge of how to keep these machines alive does not exist in any factory service manual anymore, because the factory that would have written the update sheet stopped answering the phone in 1975. It exists only in people and in the tractors that refuse, against fair odds, to stop running. The vermilion red of a Cockshutt tractor did not vanish from the Canadian landscape because the machines stopped working. It vanished because ownership of the company passed into hands, first British, then American, that had no memory of Brantford and no reason to keep the color on the paint list. But underneath that corporate story is an older, sadder truth that the collector community understands better than any accountant ever did. A tractor is only as alive as the farm it works for. When the independent family farms of the Canadian prairie began consolidating and modernizing on someone else's timeline, the machines built specifically for their scale, the plow-and-a-half outfit, the 2-family cooperative buying a co-op badged Cockshutt together, began disappearing right alongside the company that built them. The paint faded because the fence rows it once bordered changed hands. That is the real obituary here. Not the factory in Brantford, not the merger in Oakbrook, the farm, and the particular, stubborn, red-painted way of working it that an entire generation of Canadian farmers once called their own. If you grew up on one of these, or if your father did, the next story in this series is one you will want to hear.